we launched our AI detector in April 2023, a few months after ChatGPT came out, in response, obviously, to a lot of educators. But the fluency of it was quite incredible and quite shocking. We were able to see the statistical signals of AI, which, by the way, haven't changed much. And so we put the AI detector out. And there are times when that's still very useful. There are times where, right now, with Clarity, you want to see how the student is using AI. And so that's actually detection is built into Clarity as well. And so early on, it was very much focused on detection. And I think that just has evolved to be like, okay, well, now that I know that it's there, how do I think about it? Right? That's really where we are. It's like, it's there, but like, is that good or is that bad? Like, how do I think about that? And I think that's still hard for instructors. I think it's still hard for everyone because I think we're still trying to learn what cognitive shortcuts, if any, are okay and what are not okay. And this helps you kind of think twice maybe about a shortcut if you're looking to use it in that way. I believe that most students want to achieve great things in their academic career so that they can be successful in life. And I would love to talk about how AI slap is making its way into the workforce and what that's doing for educators. But it's also, I think, even with the detector, it's a conversation to have with the student to help them understand the choice they're making and the impact of that choice.
Well, hello and welcome to another episode of the EduFuturist podcast. We are excited to be in the space now. We don't talk about what time it is, what day it is, all that kind of stuff. It's all off limits, but we are very, very pleased to have another guest in the studio who is joining us from a company that many of you will have heard of who are listening to this podcast. But we're also excited to not just hear about a person who worked for a business, but about a person and their philosophy and their thinking in the future of education and what that looks like. So before I come to our guest, I'm going to really quickly ask Steve how he's doing. Anything that you need to tell us and update us on in the world of Steve and Hope. And you're doing cool stuff, aren't you, mate?
I'll give 16 minutes. No, yeah, things are good in terms of the day stuff. The weather is hit and miss. I'm trying to be quick fire with this, but I'm excited for this podcast. Absolutely. And we are ever creeping closer, Ben, to our book being launched and released. We're on final stages. We've been saying final stages for the last 5 final stages. So Ben's done a book. This is our first one collectively. So it's edging closer to being out. So and a natural.
By the time this episode airs, though, we will probably have released a book cover. Which is exciting. Which always feels like that's a real thing now. When we've got a book cover, it's real. And we're at layup and copy. We've gone past copy editing. We're in that space, so we are in typesetting. That's the phrase that we're in. That's where we are right now. So exciting, ready for a summer launch of this. Anyway, enough about that. What we're here for is a great conversation, and I am not going to try and do this badly. I'm going to ask our guests to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit where they're joining us from today.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here. My name is Annie Chechitelli. I'm the Chief Product Officer of Turnitin. I am joining you today from a central location in the U.S., Indianapolis, Indiana. The weather is okay. It could be better, but it's probably better than it is in the UK.
Absolutely, it will be. Absolutely, it will be. It's about 12 degrees centigrade here where I am. So I'm hoping it's a bit warmer than that where you are.
Yeah, and tomorrow I'm actually off. I'm headed out to New York City for my son's commencement from NYU.
Nice.
Should we just talk about that for the next hour? What does that look like as a parent? My kids are 4 and 5. I'm not imagining that just yet. Should we just spend what that looks like and all the emotions that you must be going through?
We'll talk about their use of AI. I've gotten approval from all 3 of them. So I have 2 in college and 1 graduating high school. And to make it even more interesting at our kitchen table, my husband is a high school English teacher.
Oh God, that must be a hot pot of fun. Hopefully, it's not all work. John, you can leave it a little bit. But John, so obviously you've said where you are now. Tell us a bit about
Mhm.
your backstory. Have you always been in the tech sector? What's your journey here, Annie?
Yeah, no, this one's a fun story. So, I have been in education technology for over 25 years. I joined a startup in New York City in 1999, and it was focused on bringing classes online, like pre Zoom. So, it was for live sessions online back in the day. And I joined that company about a year out of college. And it goes so far back that I remember part of my job was talking to people and asking them if they had a sound card or helping them install a sound card on a Dell tower, if you remember those days. And then you'd have to go tell them to buy a Radio Shack microphone. Do you remember Radio Shack? Yeah. Most people don't who are younger. But yeah, we would say, go buy a microphone, and they would use that. And you probably remember using that before everything was built in, before you had AirPods. And we would do classes online for different schools and certifications. And it was early 2000s internet bubble. And then we decided to pick a market, and it seemed like higher education was a really interesting market, as well as K-12, much better than like the corporate market. And I still believe that that was the right choice to focus on the education market. So the company was called Wimba, for all of those who know all of the education Wayback Machine. And we sold it to Blackboard in 2010. So I was there 99, 2010. So 11-year startup, which is a little longer than venture capitalists usually like a startup to be. But hey, it happened. So merged with Blackboard in 2010, and it became Blackboard Collaborate, which was just recently spun off a few years ago. And I always tell the story of like, I developed a tool that didn't really get usage until 20 years later in COVID, but it was successful. So I did that, stayed at Blackboard for 6 years on the higher ed EdTech side, working on bringing Blackboard back then to the cloud. And then went over to a small company called Amazon for a few years. They were trying to figure out how to better serve campuses with digital textbooks and digital products. So I was on the Kindle team and did that for a few years before I went to AWS, also on the education team. And then I've been at Turnitin as Chief Product Officer for about 4.5 years. So yeah, I've been very addicted to education technology. And I tell people that I feel incredibly lucky in that, like, I kind of had a sense that something was going to happen in 1999, right when the internet hit. And I leaned in and recognized that I was being lucky at that time in terms of being at the right place at the right time to really see a lot of change and understand how that was going to impact, or not understand, quite honestly, how that was going to impact. So, right place, right time. I feel the same way about how lucky I've been at Turnitin since LLMs became kind of a public good and in the atmosphere, to be part of that and watch that. And now even to see how AI evolves from a large language bot to something even bigger. So I've had a very lucky career.
Sounds like an epic career. Like and quite squiggly, but also, and we say squiggly careers. There's a podcast in the UK called Squiggly Careers, which helps. It's always like a navigation, but I love the fact that you start at a little start. 1999. I won't say what we were doing in 1999, but
Okay.
I'll also say that in that really early adoption space, in that early space, I imagine that the idea it's not like you can go and vibe code your idea and come up with a new space. You were literally building from scratch, how to do online, how to doing that. I'm intrigued, just before we kind of dig into what we want to talk about today, is that in 1999, when you said, do you know what, I think there might be something here, what kind of were the signals at that point that made you go, this could be something in education, there could be some use of technology in that space?
Yeah, I think it just saw the possibilities of in that space was very much focused on live online and giving students opportunities to information and teachers. And I think we're going to have a bigger conversation about the role of the teacher and how important that is. I mean, people could since the creation of the press and books, students can go and study and learn without education, a formal education, for a long time, right? The reason they haven't, and the reason that doesn't always work, is motivation, structuring curriculum, helping work between the educator and the student. And having that online and bridge the distance to me was really interesting that it no longer required you to physically be there. I know it sounds crazy to all of you working remotely now, but like it was crazy that you could participate and learn from somebody anywhere you were. And it didn't require travel. It didn't require, back then, there were a lot of K 12 schools that were rural and they didn't have an AP course. So all of a sudden, now these students can take AP courses. They've never been exposed to those new challenges. And I thought it was really going to change the offerings and the access to education in a way that we hadn't seen before.
I think that's really interesting. The squiggly line that Ben talked about and all of those wonderful companies. The reason why you joined, let's be honest, is it was either that or a Wendy's in the local area, and you thought, you know what, I don't want to work in a Wendy's, and also, you know, even if it falls flat, I can always go back and work in Wendy's, but they're offering me shares, and we're not going to go into that and all of those kind of things, Annie. I'm not going to put you on the spot, but that's definitely a start. But I think what's really interesting is the why. What you just said is actually the why, and the what and the how is potentially a startup and everything that's come post 2000 of all of those different things. But it still goes back to why. I remember talking about blended learning and doing all those kind of things in education for such a long period of time, and people say, "Yeah, but it won't replace face to face." And I was like, "Brilliant for those people that can be face to face." But also, what does the structure of face to face? If you're playing a YouTube video that now exists, to a
Mhm.
group of people sat in front of it for 30. Why are you doing that when ultimately they could be doing that individually at home? And it's that why of the Highlands in Scotland, the rurality, the ability to travel, equity of access to learning, the atolls in Maldives, all these different things, and what you've just talked about. There is many reasons why people cannot make face-to-face learning or work. And actually, the why is many, many different things. And ultimately, the tool is what you've just talked about, which is I absolutely love it. I'm infatuated, I would say, in terms of that, you know, that hodgepodge mess of what learning is and what it isn't. And ultimately, I think, like knowledge and skills in education, people see it as, no, it's this or this. And I'm like, well,
Mhm.
can't it be blended? Can't you evaluate and critically analysing clusters of groups of people, but only do that for 3 hours a day? Kind of like the webinar or the seminar model in higher ed and all the lectures. You know, I would prefer that when I was at university. Why did I get up back then and have to pretend that I was in attendance and listening when I was hungover at university? And ultimately, could I have
Yeah.
just, you know, done it by literally just listening from anywhere, online learning? And I think it's that we need to kind of unpick. So I absolutely love that. But for those people who've maybe lived under the rock or from a country that maybe you don't touch, I'm sure there are countries that maybe can't access. What is Turnitin? And maybe pretend I'm a 10-year-old and this is my first experience, Annie, and explain it to me as a 10-year-old that's just got into a lift with his parents. And maybe let's start it there rather than people on an EdTech Future Education podcast.
That's great. So actually, Turnitin is over 25 years as well in terms of the industry. Not everybody realizes that. Turnitin was created really with the advent of the internet, right? There was a lot of teachers who felt like, well, oh, students aren't going to do any work anymore. They can just copy anything on the internet, whether it be Wikipedia or something else, because now information is available very freely and very openly. And there was a fear that students wouldn't know how to properly cite that information and sometimes not do their work and use that information directly from those sites. So it was really created out of that necessity of understanding, giving teachers a little bit more understanding of where student content was coming from. And so that's how it was created. And then it evolved as we worked more with educators, directly with educators, right? Usually a company starts and it starts from a founder who knows technology. And then you add more people to the company, and those more people in the company start talking to the actual users and like, hey, this is great, but can you have this? And we learned as a company a lot more about formative opportunities and how it's really about providing and making students better writers by giving them feedback frequently and in the moment and in those essays or those documents or things that they write. And so went from being able to detect when a student copied and pasted, right? That's the basics. Then on to how does a teacher give a student that feedback in a way that's productive, that's not just telling them, hey, this matches somewhere. And then Turnitin continues to evolve as education evolves, as there are either threats to academic integrity or changes in technology. Then after that, there were the rise of essay mills. So 10-year-old Steve, I don't know if 10-year-old Steve knows what an essay mill is, but it's a place where a student can hire someone to write them a paper. And you can go today. So if you go to Google and just say, where can I buy a paper? You will see it's a very active economy. One of the things I learned at Turnitin, which surprised me, was what an active economy there is for academic misconduct and for students not wanting to do their work. And we're seeing it today. I'm sure we'll talk about that in a little bit around kind of what I would say bad actors in the space selling services to students in a way that some of this technology was not meant for. But back in 2016 to 2018, there was a lot more of that essay mill contract cheating going on, and there still is today. And so our customers said, we're having a problem, especially our customers in Australia, our customers even in the UK. We found that when there are customers who have an academic integrity office, people in the US don't always know this, but in the UK, in Australia, cheating is illegal. In the UK, it's illegal, but like, I'm not, maybe you guys can inform me of kind of how that rule works. In the US, it's just frowned upon. It's not, there really isn't the same level of like an academic integrity office as there is in Australia. And so the product was very much for those markets where there is somebody whose job it is to ensure integrity across the university. So that happened. And now Turnitin also works now with large language models, versions of AI, on how to help educators understand how students are using it and make sure that the integrity of their assignments is being upheld, whether that be using AI or whether that not be using AI. And also then helping educators learn a little bit at how students use it and visibly see how students are using it. I think that one of my complaints and where we are in this kind of what's the role of AI in students' lives in terms of education is that students are doing it by themselves in private. They're just doing it on the side somewhere, and no one's really learning how they're using it. You have some studies around like, oh, well, they're researching, they're brainstorming. Those are very broad terms. Like, exactly what are they doing? Exactly what are they asking? How are they asking those questions? And so the more we have students off doing it in a silo, in like a cave, and the teacher's not seeing that, we're kind of in this, I would say, standstill of not really understanding the best uses or the not so best uses. And so that's Turnitin. We continue to evolve, helping educators evolve with technology and making sure that students are evolving and learning the skills they're supposed to learn.
I'm going to, I love that. And I love that you have talked through some of them key thinking around thinking with AI or thinking about academic integrity or thinking around student work or thinking about their use of this. Because if we're honest, it's very easy, probably easier now than it's ever been, to shortcut thinking to be able to get an output as quickly as you can, rather than the process that's required of having an understanding of something, realizing, oh, I'm not sure about that, then relearning and changing your understanding and rethinking, and the cognitive process that goes into that space. And I think one of the elements that's sat in here is that all that AI has done has sped up that conversation of what has been on the cards since time immemorial. Now, I think about my own schooling and university, so you'll be able to age me by this. Blackboard was one of the things that was on at our university right at the end of my university space. But prior to that, that was just for submitting assignments. Really, there wasn't really everything in it that's in Blackboard now, or that has been in it since then. But interestingly, I used to have to go. I say this when I do keynotes around AI all the time. I used to have to go to this place, where there used to be a person at the front that would tell everybody to be quiet, and I'd have to sit at a table with these physical big pieces of paper bound together in a thing called a book. And that space, the library, was the place where you used to have to go to research for your university essays and assignments. And I remember going into trying to get there at a time, because I travelled into university, I didn't live on campus, trying to get there before other people to make sure that the one version of the book that was available, I could get it and be able to take it and use it. And I used to think about that process, about the access to it. And I think the access conversation around AI and technology is really important, and possibly will come up later today. But I also remember that I used to photocopy pages of it or copy things out of it, and then I was just gambling about whether I was going to get caught, right? And I was gambling about whether I was going to turn that into my own words, or whether I was going to just take it verbatim. But I think about as a 18, 19, 20-year-old boy in that space, fast forward a few years, becoming an RE teacher and getting student assignments coming in and going, hold on a minute, that's come out of Wikipedia, or that's come off that website, to now being in a position where we're going, that sounds AI generated, or increasingly now as we're getting a little bit better at this, going, I'm not sure it is AI generated, and there's all these legal cases around whether it is AI generated, and whether you can, but it's the same principle of being sat copying from a textbook, copying from Wikipedia, or copying and pasting. It's the thinking element that has not kind of changed, that lack of thinking and the training that goes with that. And I think you mentioned something, and I just want to tick here before I let you respond into it, if that's all right, is that from an AI perspective, that if we don't bring it into the thinking around this and the process and the learning, if we don't bring that into the light, it ends up becoming shady and dark, and people do it without any kind of guidance. And I think we feel like we've talked on the podcast quite a lot about this phrase agency with guardrails, and that we want to make sure that we can, rather than banning phones or banning AI or banning technology, what we really need to do is think about how do we develop agency for young people with the right appropriate guardrails for where they are on the journey.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I always, I tell people I'm not an educator. But I'm trying to listen to them to build what they need. EdTech is an interesting industry from a product management perspective, to get technical for a moment. We have a lot of personas to build for, right? There's the buyer, which many times is like, it could be somebody on the academic side, or more increasingly like an IT admin at an institution who's really just thinking about, I have to manage all these apps, and the teachers, and the teachers are the ones who are using it every day in the classroom. They're not always the ones making the buying decisions, so they lobby on behalf. And you also then have the students who are the ones who are using it as well. And so who do you design software for when you have trade-offs? And I think this is always a fun conversation. You guys should have a podcast on it. It's so interesting. We have decided at Turnitin, when there is a conflict, or like, okay, well, we can do both of those, but like they're at odds. Who do we prioritize the design for, or the product for? And we've chosen the educator as our main role. So the actual person teaching in the class. And how do we give them the tools that they need to be successful? And this is important because we want to give them flexibility to figure out and to adjust based on what assessments they have. If I think back to kind of early 2023, so just a few months after ChatGPT came out, like I think myself included, this is the one thing I said I got really wrong early on was like, oh, institutions have to have this policy. And there has to be a policy, and there's a whole bunch of policy discussion vectors, but I began to realize, like, no, it's not. It's going to be on like an assignment by assignment basis. Like, this is based on like, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to teach? What level are you teaching at? There's a lot of inputs that go into this that make it a lot more nuanced than like yes or no. And so Turnitin, our, guardrail here, our guiding post for the guardrails is like give as much as we can to the teacher to make the decision on an assignment level, on a student level, to figure out how they want to manage AI in their class. And there are times where this has been at odds, since we're, the provocative podcast where, sometimes admins or administrators, whether it's a tech administrator or an administrator in an institution, they say no. Say, no, we don't want teachers to have this freedom. We want to lock it down or not lock it down, or we want to decide on behalf of our educators. And so these are kind of the difficult conversations we have around like, well, how do we build things in a way that gives teachers control, but at the same time, we're at odds sometimes with the leadership of an institution who don't want teachers to have that flexibility or freedom. So I think that's been the hardest part of these past few years, and still is like those two constituents are not always aligned at the same institution.
Yeah, I think decisions are often made without including key stakeholders. I think ultimately, and also without sharing and gaining and supporting understanding. So often it's a case of we spoke to learners, we spoke to educators, we spoke to parents, we spoke to leaders, but ultimately, have they been educated in terms of what does this actually mean? And we've just done a sheep dip approach, and everybody treating exactly the same. Every educator falls under this persona, and every learner falls under this persona. I think it's really interesting as a higher education post K-12 product. Ultimately, Ben talked about Blackboard. When I went and did my degree, I had to spend an awful amount of money typing it up. Websites were not reliable, and you had to use journals, and you had to wind. Go into this massive room that would have been even bigger. You wound the shelving up, and you then took everything else, typed it up, and then printed it off, bound it. You had to pay for it to be bound. There were the organisations within the university that were making vast amount of money on
Yeah,
binding.
the
And then
custom book for that class.
absolutely, and then you had to post it into this little letterbox box thing that literally dropped down and destroyed the binding anyway, which was absolutely wonderful. And you did all of that and everything else. But ultimately, the production of work and the output of assessing what the learners knew hasn't really changed from whether that was completely handwritten to been typed up to been using those e-journals. How does Turnitin support educators and even decision makers? I know you said your focus is educator, but all of those conversations around is an assignment and is the written format the best way? Because if AI can produce things very, very quickly, how can we vary our assessments that are more robust and better in the world?
Yeah. So I'll give you I'll talk about a few projects we're working on, if that's okay.
Yep. Yep.
So I think that what we're hearing is that the concept of summative is more difficult in this world we're in now at evaluating student development, whether it be in the US high school or in college. We work very, very much with both, but around the world. And we're seeing a move to smaller, more formative assignments that build on top of each other, that will help teachers see what's happening and intervene, but also allow them to understand the progress of the student. The problem with that type of learning is it's a lot of work for the teacher, and we can get to ways of helping that. But we're seeing this move to more formative, as well as, I think you can say that the oldest type of test still exists, which is like an oral assessment or a defense of something, right? And you see that still very much in PhD or postgraduate programs where you write something and you defend it. People ask you questions about it, and the questions are not easy. They're follow-up questions like, well, why do you think that? What other reasons did you have? How did you, get to that recommendation? Which really helps you understand how the student is thinking. And that really is what we're after in terms of assessment. Did the student learn? Are they thinking the way that we need them to think? Um, so, so oral assessment is time consuming because you think about, okay, well, then the teacher has to meet with every person for a certain amount of time and have that discussion. And that doesn't scale super well for higher education, especially large classes. It's great for smaller classes. But we are seeing that happen more. And so, okay, well, how can we add that to our product? How do you turn something in, but then add a self reflection? Or add a self reflection that maybe has some questions that are asked like in advance, not in advance, but like on the fly to like help you. I want to see how you're thinking about this. So those are some of the things that we're looking at our products. Also, we're getting a lot around peer feedback, but not in the way it used to be. I think that like peer feedback was like it was an approach to teachers to be like, just give feedback. Steve, you give feedback to Ben. I'll grade both of your feedbacks to each other, and you can learn from each other. And we still do that. My kids complain about it all the time. Quite honestly, they tell me that they feel that's just because the teacher doesn't want to do work, and I argue with them that's not the point of the assignment. That they're supposed to learn how to give feedback and constructive criticism because that's part of the work world we're going to be in. But they don't like it. But use thinking about peer assessment more as feedback, and you can think about peer assessment very much so with AI. Like, what a great peer, right? So when you think about how does AI change peer assessment or make that more scalable or perhaps more interesting if you can get it to do the things that you want it to do, right? If you're a teacher and I can make a peer and the peer does these types of follow-up questions, and me as a teacher, I'm able to see that interaction or understand that interaction, amazing. Also, one of the features that we're looking at is around better use of custom GPTs. So there are some teachers who understand the power of creating AI simulations and using that in an education form. It's very difficult to build, right? For 99% of educators, of how do you build, uh, you want to have a conversation with George Washington, right? What would you ask? How would you have that conversation? What questions would you ask, and how would you be in that moment to understand what the troubles were at that time, to show that you have a knowledge of the time, the space, the controversies, as well as what was happening in history. It's very difficult for teachers to build this, but it's technically very easy. And so we're looking at, okay, well, let's have templates. Like, make it so teacher says, I want to have a conversation with somebody in history. I'm going to click on that. I'm going to say what it is. I'm going to put some guardrails, turn it in. We already have guardrails in our Clarity AI assistant that are very education focused. It won't do your work. It won't give your answer. And let the teacher use that. Or we have like interview people. You can have an interview for people on a certain topic. We have an example of an ethics class in which they're debating the pros and cons of bike lanes, right? These are actual real things that help students understand the decisions they're going to have to make in the real world. Not to say that, everything has to be super practical, but and students are super engaged in that. Like, oh, wait, there are pros and cons. Like, some of the folks who drive every day probably don't like it because they're going to have less room. You're going to have environmentalists who really like it. You're going to have city council who's just like, oh, make this go away. And so, why don't you create simulations so a student can interview all those different types and then write a reflection about it, right? So, it's not just engaging in that, but like based on your conversation with all these constituents that, by the way, are being played by AI because it's very difficult to actually have those conversations. And then write a reflection of what is your recommendation? Should we have bike lanes? What did you examine? What were the pros and cons? So, those are just some examples of the work that we're doing around like, how do we take not just like, I think we started very early on with like LLMs, right? Chatbots, and AI is going to be so much more than that. That conversation is already dating itself around, okay, well, what besides just I'm going to ask a question and it's going to give me an answer back that I then write? What are ways that you can engage with them that help you think? And, and I do believe many times it does need to be instructor led or instructor motivated. And I see that really looking at some examples that have fallen short. But granted, I don't think we have enough evidence. This is just my opinion. But you look at like the work that Conmigo did with Sal Khan. What he was trying to do was create this, same thing like a tutor for students. They could get anything they want. It won't give them the answer. The problem was also the age. The students were young, they're more elementary age, and they didn't know what questions to ask. And they weren't really motivated by a teacher. They didn't have that engagement with a teacher. And he's since closed Conmigo, right? The product just it didn't work. It wasn't really taking off the way they expected. And so you have to ask yourself why, right? These are very powerful tools, but what other ingredients do you need with the tool? And in some ways, it's curriculum, it's the teacher themselves, it's the point of the assessment. All those things kind of need to be wrapped together. And so I agree, like assessment, just the idea of writing a paper and that's it, has been since it's an older, in some ways, it can be an antiquated assessment. I'm a big fan of writing. I believe that writing helps you develop your thinking. And you might think you know the answer. Go ahead and write that and see if you actually know the ins and outs of that topic, because you're going to find that out in the writing process. But I think that when we're given topics where we can engage in them, and then the writing becomes a reflection kind of at the end of like, I did all of these things. I did all of this work. I actually engaged. Let me reflect on that. And I do think that's powerful, but I think it's changing and evolving.
Yeah, and I think the conversation and the question around assessment, it's good that the conversation is still on the table. We would argue that in the UK, it might be less so globally. In the UK, that question isn't on the table. It's
Oh.
exams are the only way, and actually people are doubling down. Lots of organisations are doubling down on terminal linear exams because AI can write coursework, non-examined assessment much easier. So therefore, what we're going to do is the only true way to get whether a student understands something is to and I know they could run it through a tool like Turnitin Clarity and all that kind of stuff to help in that space. But the principle that we're sat in here is that lots of organisations are saying now the only fair way to, and I say that with inverted commas for those people that are only listening and not watching, is exams. And so what we'll do in the UK, had a curriculum assessment review recently, and we don't necessarily ask you to comment on this because we absolutely have. Have said the way that the review and the way that they've changed assessment in the UK is to take give 10% longer, so that people have got more time, so it's not less. So I'm going, hold on a minute. It feels a little bit like we're moving the deck chairs on the Titanic, as opposed to really thinking about how assessment can be more than just. And I know that that's not necessarily where you're sat as an organisation, and
Yeah.
even you personally. But I agree. I always process as a tech guy somebody loves tech. I write on sticky notes. I handwrite loads of processing because that's the way that I take notes. Some people say, "Why have you not got like a digital note taker?" I was like, I have that. I have a nice little pocket tool. I have a AI note taker, but I love just writing with a pen because of that reason. And so, interestingly, in this broader conversation then about academic integrity, about assessment, to making sure that the process
Hmm.
and learning, and one of the things that you mentioned there was about the feeling that there's still possibly a need for instructor led or in and I think we would always say that it's always still going to take a teacher, but we kind of follow what Saugata Mitra says, and Professor Saugata Mitra talks about in saying that the classroom of the future is actually going to have 4 teachers. It's going to have the adult, the student themselves, the external expert, and then the machine in that space. So yes, it's not going to remove the adult in the room. It's just going to add to that in that space. Now, I'm really kind of intrigued because I know that you've probably had this conversation 1,000 times, and you're going, "Oh, are they going to ask this question again?" Is that there was this move, wasn't there, in education? But it was big in the UK around AI detectors. Okay, we need to catch these kids that are
Do they
cheating.
speak like pirates like that?
Yes. Detector. Yeah, they are. Well, it's almost like they're on this crusade to try and catch these naughty, pesky kids that are cheating using AI. And if, in fact, I must get asked that question all the time. Can you recommend a really good AI detector? I was like, no, no. But I know there was a move, wasn't there, in Turnitin away from it feeling like it's detecting cheating towards this conversation. And I know you didn't do that, but I think some people utilised it in that way. So that's where my perception outside of it. But you moved to this clarity conversation, and I wonder if you could maybe talk to us a little bit about how that position and perspective is important for Turnitin and in that process of academic integrity and making sure that learning doesn't sacrifice the thinking piece.
Yeah, I think it starts with the fact that there are so many different instructors and so many different ways they teach and so many different philosophies, right? And we don't want to be the company that says this needs to be your philosophy. So I'll start there. So we launched our AI detector in April 2023, a few months after ChatGPT came out, in response, obviously, to a lot of educators and in general. I think the world was shocked at the fluency of AI. Not always, they weren't really looking at like, does this argument make sense? Is this like actually deep or meaningful? But the fluency of it was quite incredible and quite shocking. And so for us, like we'd already started actually a year prior to that studying GPT-3. People don't realize GPT-3 came out June 2020, so years before ChatGPT came out. But it didn't have, it was an API interface. It didn't have a chat interface. And so actually the original OpenAI strategy, as we all know, has changed drastically, but was not to build applications, was to have other companies build applications that use the AI. But that didn't pan out. And so you had access early. And so we were able to see the statistical signals of AI, which, by the way, haven't changed much. How AI writes remains statistically the same as before. It is a next word generator based on the information it has and all of the internet and everything it's scraped that it maybe shouldn't have scraped, as well as what it knows about you, Ben, or you, Steve, based on, okay, well, Ben he's a teacher, he's interested in education technology, and so it might answer your questions. That next word may be a little bit different based on your context, but it still works like that. And so we put the AI detector out, and there are times when that's still very useful. There are times where, right now with Clarity, you want to see how the student is using AI, and so that's actually detection is built into Clarity as well. And so early on it was very much focused on detection, and I think that just has evolved to be like, okay, well, now that I know that it's there, how do I think about it? Right? That's really where we are. It's like, it's there, but like, is that good or is that bad? Like, how do I think about that? And I think that's still hard for instructors. I think it's still hard for everyone because I think we're still trying to learn what cognitive shortcuts, if any, are okay and what are not okay. But in order to assess that is to know that AI is there. I also think, I'm a general believer at some rate of, there was a deterrent factor. I think, Ben, as you mentioned, it can be easy to go copy and paste an encyclopedia just as it was in 1998. But you might want to think twice before you do that kind of thing. I think that we as humans are wired to take shortcuts. And this helps you kind of think twice maybe about a shortcut if you're looking to use it in that way. Listen, I believe that most students want to achieve great things in their academic career so that they can be successful in life. Do they think that way all the time? No. Do all think that? No. I think there are absolutely students who would prefer not to do any work. I don't advise that. They're going to have a tough time in the workforce. And I would love to talk about how AI slap is making its way into the workforce and what that's doing for educators. I mean, I can see it is now like in a company. What does that mean? And like, how do I know it's AI? But we're trying to have students be the best versions of themselves, and most want to be. And that's really where clarity comes in to understand the impact of AI and to help give guardrails.
I think that's the important bit, that this is the supporting learning and learners learning, whether you're an educator who's a facilitator and a guide of the learning, or a learner that's going through it. Ultimately, by just putting a metric and a measure to say fail or cheat, or
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
not,
None
I
of
just
that's
think,
good.
and I just think ultimately that ability to quickly navigate, to give the clarity to everybody involved in that conversation and that learning process, and actually flag up, this is what you've done, this is how you make it better. Those learning opportunities within AI to develop as you step through that, of go back, here's a video of just like, no, even use the AI tool to then say, here's a list of AI generated 5 things that you could do to be better with your referencing, or with citations or anything else. And I think that's the key element of, we are in a learning process, and stopping the learning there and saying, this is what we see, is a missed opportunity, I think, in many. I think that's where
I
the
agree.
clarity comes in.
But it's also, I think, even with the detector, it's a conversation to have with the student to help them understand the choice they're making and the impact of that choice. I am not a big fan of punitive anything. Like, I don't think that that's why we're here, but that's up to each institution to choose the rules that they have. But like my husband, I talk to him all about it all the time. And he definitely, in high school, you know your students a little better. So you really know if something doesn't really sound like them. And he'll tell them, he'll say, I need to see you after class, which no kid wants to hear. It's the worst thing ever. And he'll be like, did you write this? I don't feel you wrote this. And I will make you redo it. And the highest grade you can get now is like a B minus if you get it perfectly. But at least it gives them an opportunity to continue to have that conversation and then improve. But that's why I believe in the educators so firmly, is like they're the ones who are trying to figure out what the student is doing and what that impact is.
And I suppose that leads on to an accountability question in
Yeah.
regards to Turnitin says that it doesn't decide what's classed as cheating or what counts as
hmm
cheating and everything else. That's down to the organisation to identify it, the educator, and all in the decision making. What's your stance on that, as a
Yeah, we've
company, and
had that
maybe for
same.
you?
Yeah, no, we've had that same stance pre AI, right? That's why we don't say we do. If you look on our website, we don't say we do plagiarism detection because plagiarism has intent. We do similarity detection. There's a difference. I know it's subtle, but it is. Because there are many times where a student might have poorly paraphrased. We mentioned there's good paraphrasing, like that. That's part of learning how to write. It's paraphrasing. A lot of times the students will not cite things properly, or there'll be too much work that they've included. And so even back in the day, we were like, it's up to the teacher. My daughter has a teacher in high school who says 12% similarity is their threshold. And I was like, well, she's like, well, what do you say? And I go, there isn't a percentage. We will never give a percentage. You will never see that on our website. And first of all, 12% is ridiculous. But and so she's like, can you come talk to my teacher about this? I was like, I'm not sure that's my place, but I will tell you, like, I would never say that like there's a cutoff. And then AI is the same way, right? And that's the same around like, first of all, is it allowed? Is it not allowed? How much is allowed? It's interesting. We very early on, it was about a year into AI, and like I didn't know the answer to that. Like, what do people think? How much is okay? Like, how much is that? So we did a survey of like, okay, teachers, like generally, where do you say that cutoff is? If you're like, well, if it's like and we found that it was like 30% for not in general. There are some who say absolutely nothing, not one word, right? But we found that teachers are like, well, like we feel like spidey sense, like 30% is kind of okay. once you get above that, you think about it. And like, there's no right answer. I will say people kind of know some guardrails though. We tend to turn it in, and I agree. Unless the assignment is you write with AI. If it's like, don't use it a lot, or like use it as a guide, 80% or more feels too much. Everyone kind of aligns on that. And so we use that as like, if there's 80% or more AI, that seems like misconduct in written assignments. And we still have about 13% of our papers have 80% or more, just in terms of like understanding. We get to see all that comes in across the world. And that's still kind of, some people are actually say like, oh, I thought it'd be higher. And then some people say like, that seems high. So it's interesting, that figure. That's just a data point. About 13% are 80% or more.
Okay, that's an interesting move, right? And it's also, I think it comes back to that piece that you mentioned earlier about co-creation and about it being educator led, and actually the tool being something that we can do beyond that. I suppose. Got one last question before we
Yeah.
do our quick fire questions, if that's all right. And I suppose it's a question around what's next. And I know you can't give us a product roadmap.
Mhm.
I'm not asking for that. But
I
I
gave a little bit
suppose,
of some.
yeah,
Yeah.
you did. Yeah, you did.
Uh-huh.
It's about, what do you think we'll ever see that world where educators, schools, EdTech companies like work together more closely around how AI shapes learning? And are you seeing any like shoots uh, of hope in that space, and also, but what do we think's next? What does it look like next? Because you've
Here's
been
what I
in
want.
this conversation
Yeah.
earlier, right?
Yeah. And I've been frustrated for about a year. Because here's what I don't see. I'm not a learning scientist. I know that they exist. There are lots of universities in the world. I want to see somebody say and write a paper or write something that has some evidence that says using AI in these types of settings in education don't seem to impact cognitive and problem solving, critical thinking skills. This is where it starts to cross the line, and you probably shouldn't use it in these ways. If you're trying to achieve this, my point is even when we say like, oh, brainstorming, it seems okay. I've read plenty of articles that say, no, it's not okay, because you limit your brainstorming. Like, you very quickly, you're like in what it tells you, you're not thinking outside. But then again, if you're staring at a blank sheet of paper, I think it's pretty good, right? So even brainstorming is kind of controversial. So what parts are okay to offload for students, and what parts do we need to keep at different levels of education? Right. This work, I actually went back. I studied early work of the calculator, and I was like, okay, well, like, how did that happen? What was the research that made people feel like, oh, it's okay? And at what points do you need to introduce it, and why? Shockingly, there's not a lot of research. I was like shocked by how little there was back then. I guess we just figured it out as we went along. But I'm looking for some amount of research that says, when should it be introduced? How should it be introduced? What are the cautionary tales? Um, and what are the things we need to start researching? Like, we'll give the tools to do that. Like, that's what I want. That's what I commit to. And we'll even look at, like, if we want to I'm happy to partner with an institution and provide anything or compensation to help them, or a grant, whatever that looks like, to help them move forward with this. But I can give them the tools that make it so they can turn it on or off, or how they're using it. But I need someone to then do a test or evaluation of, did the student actually cognitively develop?
It's interesting. We interviewed Rob Westman from School AI, and they've not about that as a product. School AI did do a research of nearly 14,000 students, and so
What grades
over
is that? A school AI that's more elementary.
it was
I think it's K-12.
yeah,
Mm.
It's
K-12.
definitely K-12 rather than higher.
So I know that's setting that. But interestingly, the research found that 28% of it showed us 28% boost in critical thinking in partnering with AI. I'll share the link with you later on. But interestingly, it's not necessarily saying that it's done. I don't think it's done the research that you were absolutely suggesting there. But school AI saying that it helps with thinking as opposed to hinders thinking if we utilize it effectively. And
Do you know
school
that
AI are going to say that.
the publication, I'll send this to you guys. This just came out last week. That the publication a year ago from Nature magazine, which is like an incredible scientific publication, they're
Yeah.
reversing. They're retracting the story that AI is good for learning. Like that's shocking. It's shocking that no
Wow.
one's covering that either.
Yeah, wow. And
It's-
there's also the AI slop conversation, isn't there? That people are going, hold on a minute, there is that there.
We
Yeah,
can do
I
that if
think
you invite me back. I'm happy to talk about
well,
AI slop and what I see in the workforce and how I don't want to have students bring that with them.
well, you've heard
Sure.
it, everybody that's listening in. That we thought we'd upset Annie so much that she'd never come back. That's just we have some people that have returned 5 times, but we have a lot of people that would never come back on again. They're definitely not our people, and that's fine, Annie. Joe, you can be in our gang. But I think what you've just said and what I've taken from Ben and the last couple of minutes is ultimately clarity. We've
Mhm.
done a terrible job. And the same with social media. We just do this with technology and any innovation, really. We do a really terrible job of communicating and giving clarity of actually that we're all learning together. If you think about AI, especially in the education context, I know AI is not new, but we haven't really done a great job with our learners learning right now and educators to then say, well, ultimately, we're just trying to get the evidence and we're going through a process because we don't know. We're trying to find it and we think it could be this could be the impact. And we think from the studies that it could be this. Let's do a longer study because ultimately there's so much out there that's conflicting that some will say it's good, some will say it's bad. And I think you've just said, ultimately, how do we
It's
narrow that
both.
down? And this is the thing of there is no right and wrong. And that isn't that learning. Isn't learning going through a process and trying to understand and put a context to it? Isn't that what the whole as a product is trying to achieve? And ultimately by saying, we think we know better than everybody else, regardless. I think, and I'm not saying Turnitin is, I think
Yeah,
education
I
does
hear
it.
you.
We just do a terrible job of really
Marketing
communicating.
departments love to do it. Actually,
Absolutely.
I'm going to use you too. I'm going to ask you guys a question, and then I swear I'll hand this podcast back to you.
Yeah.
But my one question to both of you
Yeah.
is, how do you feel about the phrase AI literacy? Go.
How do I feel
It's
about
not a
it?
trick question.
Go on, Ben.
It's not a trick question.
I have lots of theories, and I think I like the idea that we want to help people become literate, but the idea that literacy is the only way that I think there's a misconception about becoming able to read and write using AI, and the concept of reading AI and writing AI as concepts. I have a challenge with, but I also think that it's creating a set of tools and a set of commercial products, which then is almost commoditizing AI use. So I am a little bit like not sure what I think
Like,
about it, if I'm honest.
okay.
Yeah,
Steve.
Steve.
I see it as exactly the same thing as blended learning and technology enhanced learning. It's just learning. Literacy is just literacy, and you can put AI at the front of it and technology at the front of it, but ultimately it's just literacy. It's just learning. And ultimately these are tools and things and different ways that we do it. But ultimately it's just the core principle of literacy.
Okay. Thank
That
you.
feels like
Annie,
that.
what do you think?
That's in.
What do you think? Have
That
we
was
got your
definitely
MDF
loaded,
funding?
wasn't it?
Have we got your MDF funding? Have we managed to secure MDF for this research and to get some stuff out there?
Well, we have
By
an
the
internal
way,
debate
just
about this. I'll
let
be
me just
honest with you
explain to our
guys.
listeners
Yeah.
what MDF. I'm not talking about the type of wood. Market development funds is the thing that drives marketing and relationships in. But Annie, sorry, I jumped in there, but I just want to explain the fact that I'm not talking about wood on the podcast to everybody else. Go on, Annie.
We have internal debates on this term. I think that people are starting to use it. It's like, we're going to teach AI literacy. And I am a little bit too much of an academic to be okay with that term. And maybe you'll see it on my website and then you can come back and be like, it looks like you lost that. But I feel as though AI is so broad. Like, do you mean LLM literacy? Do you mean you're learning agentic AI? Like, for companies to be like, we promote AI literacy, I just don't know what that means, honestly. And it feels like it's a term that we need to define if we want to use, because I think it can mean anything and nothing all at once.
Yeah.
And just before we go into the quickfire, which we will get into, which will be quickfire, Andy, don't worry, is that whole thing of maybe AI literacy is exactly the same as EdTech. Ultimately, it's such a broad thing. Do you mean a learning management system? Do you need the in-classroom technology? What do you mean? And it's so diverse that ultimately classing AI as one mechanism when AI actually as a field is so diverse is really narrowing it and actually disadvantaging actually what the conversation is.
Yeah.
Which I think
Yeah.
is just summarising what you were saying, really. I like to do that, especially for our British folk. But yeah, we always do quick fire. Annie, I know that
Okay.
you've, in
Quick fire.
preparation, your marketing team have basically
I
absorbed
don't
every single
always
podcast and
follow
pass
what
it on.
they tell me to do, if you can figure that out by now.
Absolutely, you're a proper yeah. Literally, you've sat on the call with your fingers up to the marketing team and to us potentially. So anybody that's not watching it and listening to it, then go back and watch it because Annie's basically giving one and then two fingers up. Isn't because she's from Turnitin and she's professional. But let's go into that space. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
First question,
Okay.
then Ben, then me. If schools were judged like restaurants by how much customers actually enjoyed the experience, what would change overnight?
I don't think learning is always enjoyable. So I don't like thinking that we would make schools be conducted by student ratings.
Okay.
In the moment, I think 20 years later, yeah.
Sometimes
Okay.
learning's hard. Sometimes food is not enjoyable. It's
Sometimes
fuel.
it's Brussels sprouts, right? Yeah.
Exactly. But that was bacon. I can do it, right? So put a little bit of bacon in the
So American.
learning.
So American. Don't know what's happened here. For everybody that you did get
Bacon
the
and Brussels
accent,
sprouts.
throw
Amazing.
bacon in there. Let's have steak and eggs for breakfast. Come on.
The second quickfire question is:
Yeah.
what's the most dangerous myth that educators tell themselves to avoid real change?
That students today don't have the attention and rigor to learn like they used to.
Awesome. Final one. If a 10-year-old asked you why you have to go to school, what would you actually say?
Because you can't stay here.
Sounds like a conversation that's happened. And also the husband as well. Get out of town and go to work, everybody. Get out of my house.
Yes, because you can't stay here. That is the best answer we've ever had. It's been an
Isn't
absolute
that a song
pleasure.
as well, by the way? Just to,
You can't stay here. There probably is a country song. Steve loves a little bit of country.
Absolutely massive country fan. Okay.
Annie, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us and for giving us the insights you've given us and for the work that you're doing. And if you are listening to this and haven't looked at what Turnitin are doing and the work that they're doing around Clarity, particularly, please do have a look. And we'll put some links in the show notes. Connect with Annie. I'm sure that there's plenty of people in the team as well that they'll be able to connect into. Or if you want to do the research, she said it. She said she'll help. But for those of you that are listening, as well, if you're not on the Edge of Futurist Uprising, come and join us on the 25th of June in Liverpool. You would be absolutely welcome if you want to do. If you can, join us. And it's been a pleasure. We've had another great episode, and looking forward to the next time we're going to talk about AI slot. Isn't that right, Annie? Thank you for joining us.
I can't wait. Thank you both.
Speak soon. Bye bye.
Shaping the next generation. Dancing to the rhythm, catching every beat. Together we embrace the futures at our feet. The futures at